Welcome back to After Order, a series from Macrodose and the Alameda Institute exploring power, sovereignty, and crisis in today's unstable world. In our first episode, I spoke with Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff about their book, Muskism, a guide for the perplexed, examining the intellectual history of our emerging post-liberal moment through the unlikely avatar of Elon Musk. In today's show, we're moving from the ideological roots of our contemporary world to something far more concrete, the shifting material foundations of modern capitalism, and in particular, the green energy transition. To do that, I'm joined by none other than Thea Riofrancos, author of the recent book Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. As governments and corporations race to decarbonise the global economy, demand for minerals like lithium has exploded. But as Thea's research makes clear, the green transition is also opening up new frontiers of extraction, with profound consequences for landscapes, communities, and global politics. So the question at the heart of today's conversation is a simple but urgent one. Can the shift to renewable energy avoid reproducing the same extractive dynamics that defined the fossil fuel age? And what does the answer mean in a world after order? So, Thea Riofrancos, thank you for joining us in After Order.
Pleasure to be here.
Your book is analysis of what you call green capitalism, which I think for many of our listeners and viewers will be something of an oxymoron, that capitalism is an inherently exploitative and extractive system of human beings and especially of nature. So I wanted to ask, what do you mean by this phrase and how do you develop it as you do your analysis?
It is an oxymoron if we take green in a really substantive sense. The idea that capitalism would somehow internalize all of its natural externalities and all of its contamination and waste. And that's not what I mean by it at all. And I think it's useful to hold on to that critical perspective about the impossibility of capitalism fully greening itself. But we have to think empirically about political economy, and we need concepts that kind of train our analytic gaze on certain sectors, certain supply chains, firms, and investors. And we need some way to disambiguate the capitalist economy so we can understand how to transition out of it, both for sustainability reasons, but also for all sorts of other crises that capitalism is causing worldwide. So when I think about green capitalism, I think about it in material terms and in investment terms, a set of sectors, supply chains that are involved in some activity labeled as green. And we can get critical about that. There are unproven technologies that are speculative and probably quite harmful, like geoengineering, that might fall under this rubric. But then there's quite reliable technologies like solar panels and lithium batteries that in green socialism we would want to retain. And so I think first we can think technologically, but then second, there's a way of analyzing when we think about fractions of capital. What are different capitalists, both in the form of corporations and in the form of their financial backers, doing in the economy, and how do they relate to one another? If we think of green capital as a fraction of capital, we can start asking, I think, more interesting questions. How does it align or not align with other fractions of capital? War making, fossil fuels, finance, big tech. We see moments where those sectors might align in their lobbying efforts and their underlying investments and their material underpinnings. Other moments where there are tensions between capitalists, which is useful for green strategy and for socialist organizing to understand how capitalists might relate to one another. And maybe, one other important point to bring in is that when we start looking analytically and empirically at green capitalists, even if we put kind of scare quotes around that, we can then think, how do they relate to the state? That's the other side of political economy. One of the most important features of green capitalism is how fundamentally state and policy and therefore politically dependent it is as a set of sectors, which is as obvious in its moments of growth, funded by subsidies and, tax breaks and all sorts of political arrangements, but also on the flip side in its moments of kind of political precarity when there's right-wing backlash or fossil fascist backlash against it. Understanding those dynamics means that we need some set of labels to kind of analyze the capitalist economy as a whole and think through what the possibilities are under our current economic system to get some greening underway, some mitigation, some adaptation. This is urgent. We can't wait for some socialist future to start greening the economy as well as making it more equal and having a bigger role for the public sector. So seeing that path towards true sustainability and also a post-capitalist system means we have to understand the present day reality of these political and economic relationships.
I want to pick up on this bit about your point about, which is a right one, and it's, it goes all the way back to, well, anybody who's serious about analysing capitalism ends up talking like this, but Marx's old band of warring brothers, that you have fractions of capital, that there isn't a unified capitalist interest in any of this. There's a sort of general interest in exploitation, making profit, that sort of thing, but not really a specific interest. And it looks like, at least if you go and stand in the US, the green capitalist fraction of that ruling class is very much on the back foot at the minute. So is that going to be a permanent state of affairs? How do you see the dynamic between what is still very significant investment, even in the US, in kind of green capitalism, renewables, battery technology, this sort of thing? How do you see that relating to what the Trump administration is doing in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big lessons of the past few years in the US and in some other global north economies has been precisely how politically weak green capitalists are. And that changes our analysis a little bit. In the early days of my own experience, eco-socialist organizing, Green New Deal organizing, we did frame green capitalists as the enemy because they would be the bosses in the kind of new energy regime, or the investors or the financiers in the new energy regime that, we thought was coming actually quite rapidly. But instead, those green capitalists were fundamentally reliant on alliances with tech, with finance, with the kind of military-industrial complex, with fossil capitalists as well. And that weakened their position. Once we had a kind of right-wing backlash, what we saw was the real downgrading of the green capitalists in that coalition, and instead the real strengthening of we could say their allies that were already more stronger than then. And so the kind of contradiction from a left perspective is, how do you exist both in tension and maybe some degree of conflict with these emergent capitalist sectors, while also having some underlying interest, I would say, in seeing them grow and kind of further their own ambitions, but not precisely in alliance with the worst and most nefarious. Again, I'm going to bring in the warmongers just because of the moment that we're in right now, and the fossil fuel interests. We need to think of ways to sever or to create a wedge between those economic interests and those political interests. Because as it stands, green capitalists rely on fossil capitalists for broader kind of all of the above energy lobbying. And that is a really terrible position, for them. We don't have to feel so bad for them, but definitely for greening the economy.
You mentioned the Green New Deal, which, throughout the 2010s, I suppose, became an organizing point for much of the left across the world, not just the environmental movement, but far broader than that. And you think Bernie Sanders' campaign, AOC back in the day, versions of it ended up inside of Corbynism in 2017 and 2019 general elections in particular. And I think part of what your book gets into is a bit of a critique of the Green New Deal as potentially something that's still aligned with an extractive model of the economy, that you could rush off and build loads and loads of electric vehicles, and you change your old fossil fuel-based car production system into one that's switched over into producing electric vehicles, which in turn, and we can come back to this point, relies very heavily on massive amounts of lithium for all the batteries you're going to use, for example, and the copper in all the wiring you're now using, which are very, very, as you argue and as you demonstrate in the book, are heavily extractive industries. So I suppose the question there is, what do we do instead? That having gone through Green New Deals of various sorts and having tested these in some ways electorally, and actually the closest I think we got to something like this in power for all its many and varied faults is actually what Joe Biden did in the US. It's kind of watered down Green New Deal. And people would say this, but nonetheless, it's a hefty investment in US terms in some of this technology. That seems to have been completely knocked out of the water. I think you also suggest that it was too closely related to versions of extraction and to versions of that very exploitative process that was necessary to take this kind of technologically driven Green New Deal renewable switchover that you might envisage capitalism undertaking. So what do you think we would do instead?
I think the central insight of the Green New Deal remains as relevant as ever, perhaps more relevant than ever. I always took the central insight of the Green New Deal to be that there is a fundamental connection, materially and politically, between the climate crisis and the crisis of socioeconomic inequality, and that the public sector, broadly understood, plays a major role in transforming both of those, with protagonists in the labor movement, in social movements, in community organizing, et cetera. That central insight, more relevant than ever, because we're witnessing the combination of a cost of living crisis, itself fueled by war and extractivism and the fossil fuel industry. And to get out of both of those, we need a muscular state, but conceived in democratic and kind of public terms, to kind of push through a new energy system, a new political system. So I would not let go or kind of throw the Green New Deal under the bus, but I do think it needs to be updated in a number of ways. And you've named some of them, so I'll just reiterate. we need a more internationalist perspective with the Green New Deal. First and foremost, from my point of view, that's because of the extractive frontiers that you mentioned. Even if we have more mining in the global north, which seems to be the ambition of every global north government to kind of onshore and reshore these extractive processes, even if that occurs, which it's happening in fits and starts, the vast majority of these minerals are slated to come from Africa, Latin America, and Indonesia. That's according to any forecast. So the issue of extractive frontiers, of sacrifice zones, of global economic and ecological inequality remains live, and Green New Deal advocates in the global north need a response to that, and better yet, they need real relationships with Green New Deal type, whatever it's called, advocates in the global south. So that's one piece. Second, on the international front, we also need a response to the question of geopolitics, great power conflict, and maybe fundamentally the question of China. I'm not going to lay out what our response should be, but I think we were much too domestically focused, both on the extractive side, but also on the kind of geopolitical and the questions of development, of sovereignty, of global coordination. We need answers to those questions. The second thing that I would say about updating the Green New Deal, aside from internationalism, is maybe more domestic political economy. We need better responses to how do we confront and phase out the fossil fuel industry. There was a bit of a win-win-win kind of idea of the Green New Deal that everyone would benefit. No, there's a major loser, and there needs to be a major loser. They're the fossil fuel industry. They should feel and be existentially threatened by any real transition. And I think there was a hesitance, especially among our political allies on the kind of left of the elected political spectrum, to really confront that reality. We also witness the kind of stickiness of fossil fuels, not just on a finance and political level, but in the built environment. How do we actually transform these built infrastructures around us? And how do we do so in ways that are sensitive to the cost of living crisis that working and middle class people are facing in the global north and more severely in the global south? We need to think about the sequencing and temporality of long-term investments paired with short-term, I would say, economic populist measures to buffer people from the vicissitudes of the fossil capitalist economy, of the climate crisis, but also of the green transition and kind of that build out and what it will entail economically.
That feels like an important part of what we need to do. There's a bit more sort of honesty and clarity about what's going on here and what it entails. I mean, I return to Joe Biden. It's sort of unfair to tar everybody with the same kind of Biden brush on this, but very, very strikingly, his line that, when I hear climate change, I think jobs, as if this is actually all going to work out for the best and it's a win-win-win. Whereas in reality, as you say, there are sort of clear losers from a process of transition. That is just what is going to happen. So managing that, I think, is important. The difficulty we faced, I think, is that a sort of straight energy type transition, the decarbonisation, that we're all going to have renewables with batteries and everything's going to switch over into wind farms and solar panels and electric vehicles, is that this is not necessarily a particularly jobs rich process either. And I think the part where it was oversold, at least in the global north, is that, we'll just kind of, you're making a car that's a petrol engine today, we're going to make an electric vehicle tomorrow, and all you people had a job making that car are going to carry on basically doing the same thing over here. Whereas, the most productive car factories on the planet right now are the ones churning out electric vehicles in China, which have really not very many people working in them. That gets me onto something that you've touched on that I wanted to talk about, because it strikes me as like an important new development in this, which is the question of development. That some of the places you've mentioned are sites for extraction of the minerals that you need to make this transition work are themselves also now going much more rapidly than we might have anticipated a few years ago into a form of the energy transition. So I'm thinking the really incredible spread of solar energy in Africa, like imports to sub-Saharan Africa, solar panels up 60% in the last sort of year or so, 2 years, for example. So a real switch from often places that had really limited access to electricity to suddenly like actually brand spanking new technology that allows electricity to be generated in these places. This is a proximity of sites of extraction with a form of development. And it feels to me that this at least challenges some ideas we might have about core and periphery, for example, in the economy. That there is a north which is inherently extractive, and then there is a south which is being extracted from. That particularly when you have, for example, Chinese-made solar panels being installed in sub-Saharan Africa, these are quite different sets of relationships that are being developed over time.
Yeah, so the massive expansion of green technologies in China, which has come along with massive improvements in manufacturing, efficiency, economy of scale, all sorts of economic dynamics that, even in a kind of quite for-profit driven environment, are dramatically reducing the margins on these products and making them much cheaper, making them available to the global south. That has changed in some ways the formula or the equation of development and climate action. It has brought those to be much more commensurate with one another. Several years ago, I mean, if we were having this conversation, even maybe 5 or 10 years ago, we would have really talked about the issue of how development goals might be in conflict with climate action because it was cheaper to do coal-powered development. And maybe there was just an expected norm that the global south would recapitulate the coal-powered development of industrial revolutions in the US, UK, elsewhere, Western Europe in the past. But that is simply no longer necessary. And on top of that, there are major human developmental gains to be had in just the massive expansion of clean electricity, which gives people energy, which is a human right, but also makes that energy less locally polluting, dealing with one of the major global killers of air pollution and particulate matter. So these are enormous strides that I do not want to downplay. But I'm not sure that a country that still exports lithium or export rare earths and import solar panels or lithium batteries has escaped some of the fundamental issues of, quote, underdevelopment as understood by dependency theorists and world system theorists and heterodox development economists today. We may be bringing extraction and then the consumption of the end use technologies closer together, and that might alleviate some of the tensions and dilemmas of development. But that's different than actually bringing the manufacturing and other parts of the supply chain, diversifying where manufacturing takes place. One of the central inequalities of global supply chains is that extraction, low value added, highly toxic, contaminating, leaving behind a trail of poverty, takes place in quite different zones of the economy, usually, than manufacturing, let alone than the end use consumption and then end of life recycling and all of the value that accumulates further down the supply chain. I think in order to really frontally address that, green industrialization needs to be more diversified geographically. There are some strides happening here, and I think it's quite interesting that Chinese firms are not simply quote unquote dumping, and I use that in scare quotes intentionally, but that's the way it's often framed in the media, are not just dumping solar panels onto Africa or Pakistan or Chile or wherever it is. They are also now, because of governmental policies in the global south, starting to diversify where manufacturing is taking place. So governments from Latin America to Africa to South Asia have started to put on like local content requirements and other types of requirements. They're saying, no, you can't just like send us the solar panels. You need to manufacture them here, or at least assemble them at some stage. So we're starting to see in early days the diversification of this industry, which to me is a bit more convincing than just saying, oh, people can buy the cheap solar panels, because then you still have the questions that dependency theorists called unequal exchange, ecological and economic, that people are dealing with the environmental burden of extraction and not getting really the developmental benefits, including just uplifting people into better and more dignified forms of work, growing the tax base, technological sophistication and upgrading, all of those benefits that come, they don't come through consumption alone. They come through kind of reformatting globally where industry takes place, what types of industry exist, and in what types of economic clusters.
I mean, on that, I suppose two things. One is that your description of, and you mentioned it earlier, your description of a world where you potentially have sort of extraction taking place here, and then production of electricity with solar panels and allowing consumption to take place. So you have extraction potentially quite close to where consumption is also occurring. If there's a serious move to put extraction back into the global north, which is kind of happening in lots of different ways. I mean, the really spectacular, under-discussed change in the world economy in the last 10 years has been the shale revolution in the US, right? The US moving from a net oil and petroleum and fossil fuel importer to a massive exporter doesn't insulate it entirely from what happens in the global market. It turns out, as time speaking, this is pretty dramatic what's happening to fuel prices inside the US because of what's happening in the Middle East. But it does shift the balance of where extraction is taking place and which countries are doing it. Do you have, the largest mass consumption market on the planet is also now the biggest fossil fuel exporter on the planet. In other words, it's kind of taking on some features that you might have associated with global south development in the past. And potentially this is a line that capitalism in general will follow, whether it's on fossil fuels or extraction of things more closely related to renewable energy production, for instance.
One of the most surprising elements of my research, which started out as a project just on Chile or just on South America, and I thought I'm going to follow the contours of what I would think of as a neo-colonial world system in which raw materials are produced in the global south, they're sent to the global north, and then the global south reimports, the final goods made with their own raw materials on a kind of losing end of an economic and ecological hierarchy. And that remains the case. I really want to underscore that. As I said, the lion's share of these minerals are still forecast to come from global south societies and landscapes. And in general, the kind of structural relationship in which the global south is a net contributor in physical terms of raw materials, also of embodied land and labor and energy, and as well as a net loser in monetary terms from trade. The most up-to-date empirical research says that basic kind of law of capitalism, let's say, remains the case. However, there are interesting changes at the margins that I think are quite important. Now, it's not a marginal phenomenon for the U.S. to be a major fossil fuel producer. That's not marginal. But what I think will remain marginal for the next years to come will be the global north kind of in-housing or reshoring critical mineral production. It is important, but it's not going to replace global south imports. So I want to be super clear about that. Yet, it's still a surprising development that we need to attend to that is changing the politics of extractive sectors in interesting ways and maybe illuminating some changing hierarchies around who is exposed to this ecological harm. So I'll come back to your core and periphery comment in a moment. But what was unexpected to me at the start of this research would be that the EU would proclaim an ambition to be self-sufficient in lithium by 2030. That was a few years ago. I don't think that we're quite en route to that yet. So you see why I say that the global south will still be quite relevant. In the US, too, you have a lot of development of new lithium mines and copper mines and reopening of a major rare earth mine. So you have an interesting shift, totally motivated by geopolitics and also by what has been revealed to be the major fragility of globally dispersed supply chains under conditions of pandemic, of global war, of great power conflict, etc. So that is a very interesting turn that I did not expect at the beginning of my research. The relationships of core and periphery, of places that produce raw materials and get underdevelopment, in return, and then places that profit from that and where a lot of the benefits to either consumers or investors accumulate. That key dialectic of capitalism is at every scale, meaning we can see it within countries, we can see it within world regions, and we can see it globally. That does not equate the position of being a frontline community in Africa or Latin America and being a community potentially impacted by mining in Europe or the UK or the US. The risks and the bodily harm and the threats of violence are just so much worse in the global south. Many more people are killed in the global south resisting mining than we could even imagine taking place in the global north. That said, the basics of that inequality, of that giving of raw materials and getting so little in return and living amid contamination and toxicity, we can see that within the countries in the global north that are affected by fossil fuels, that are affected by mining, just as we can elsewhere. And what's been fascinating is to witness communities north and south become aware of that and actually enter into global networks of activism that are anti-extractive, that I think provide a different form of internationalism and solidarity that is in quite interesting relation with the ongoing and uneven energy transition.
The standard leftist basis for this would not be internationalism of, oh dear, look at these poor people elsewhere. If you're in the global north, look at these poor people elsewhere in the world. There's a sort of charity effort that you need to put into here. It'd be something more like we all have a shared collective interest in seeing an end to capitalism. That would be the usual way of trying to pitch this, which is something that gets disrupted if you have a fairly strict version of a core periphery relationship. That if you have what once upon a time you might call a labor aristocracy in the north, which was profiting in part from super exploitation and extraction in the south. This would break the potential for that internationalism here. I think what you're hinting at here perhaps is a different kind of that self-interest, which is that once you have everyone affected by some version of pollution, of climate change, everyone has an interest in dealing with pollution and climate change, right? So it's not we're all suffering exploitation in the same way because we all have capitalism and that gives us a common interest. It's more like we're all suffering the consequences of capitalism existing and that gives us a common interest, for example.
Yeah, I think that we can think, and I draw on other authors here, of a kind of global climate or kind of eco-proletariat in a way, a set of people that are disproportionately affected by both the harms of climate change, but also also the harms of the energy transition, and also whose labor and land is being enrolled in the process of creating that energy transition. And broadly construed, I think there's a lot of opportunities for North-South alliances and also alliances within North and South countries between rural and urban populations. And we should think, too, about that as a central divide that has kind of roiled the politics of the energy transition as well.
What would that look like in practice, do you think? Do you have examples that are emerging around that?
I think that there absolutely are examples in resource frontiers. And so that's what I was alluding to before, that there are global networks like Yes to Life, No to Mining. There are other networks and other NGOs that have played a role in kind of mediating connections between frontline communities. Sometimes these communities are facing the same company or facing a very similar type of mine. They share tactics, they share strategies. There is an awareness, again, that there is some difference in position. A lot of that is defined by how exposed to you are violence. And there's just much more violence in the global South in supporting extractive industries and kind of pushing them forward. But that important element aside, there's so much in common. These companies treat communities in similar ways. Governments tend to subsidize companies, extractive companies in similar ways. The political terrain of extractive sectors, there's a lot of similarities North and South. And there's a lot to be learned from the global South, I would say, in the global North, as now we're facing new frontiers of extraction here in Europe, in the UK, and in the US.
But this does kind of shift the balance of where you might think your strategic opportunities are, right? The historic version of the left, particularly the bit influenced by at least the main version of Marxism, would say something like, well, it is the point of production. It is where people are employed. It is where they're exploited because they're employed. They're producing profit, surplus value. That is where your major point of trying to influence the whole system start to emerge, right? This is the classic labor movement, the social democratic parties, socialist, even revolutionary parties all have this kind of conception of where you need to think about first. From what you're saying, it actually sounds like that locus has shifted somewhere else, that you're not talking about production now, you're talking about something closer to consumption or potentially social reproduction. In other words, how you live your life and how people care for you, how people look after each other, how we keep society going separately from producing things.
Yeah, when you were talking about the earlier vision of a Green New Deal and how focused it was on kind of blue collar, and I use that again with scare quotes, I don't love the term, but we know what it means, manufacturing labor, that we were going to kind of recreate an industrial revolution, but electrified or green. And that was not only going to be the basis of our economy, but it was going to be the basis of political support for a GND, that you were going to have labor union, kind of a male image and hard hats kind of supporting these policies. And I think that was a very narrow way always, an increasingly insufficient way to think about the labor, but also the sites of class conflict and class struggle associated with energy transition. First and foremost, we need to think much broadly about services, about care, about social infrastructure as sites of labor, but also as sites of conflict and organizing. And as I hinted at before, also think of ecology and landscapes and human nature relations as sites of both class conflict when they are when capital attempts to appropriate those spaces to its own ends, but also as sites where we can build new political coalitions, build new visions of what a post-capitalist economy would look like, and care, whether ecological or social, needs to be much more central to our understanding of the green transition, both in its economic forms, but also in its political underpinnings.
I mean, speaking of the political underpinnings, you talk a lot the empirical part of the book is quite significantly about South America and the lithium triangle, which up until pretty recently, the countries that are primary to that, which is what Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, were all in the hands of the left, or just about in the hands of the left. And there are sort of interesting questions, if you look at the experience of the government in Chile, for example, of how it tried to manage utilizing this resource and turning it into something that would be of general social benefit. There's great stocks of lithium that are there, extracted in a horribly extracted process. It's polluting, it's dangerous, it's unpleasant, it's exploitative for the people involved. And there was always a kind of tension between trying to manage that and then thinking you could build something socially just out of the end of it. I'll come back to that particular question, but there is this issue now where very concretely these are governments now in the hands of the right. And they themselves are left with sets of relationships with, for instance, China. I mean, Argentina and the Milei government's relation with China as a whole, almost hilarious story in itself, if you look at the backwards and forwards and the fire and brimstone that he was talking about, the number one assassin on the planet and all this sort of thing. And then, they threatened to pull swap line support for his government, and he pretty rapidly brought to heel. But they have these sets of relationships that, despite the rhetoric, particularly from Milei, where he's Trump's biggest fan outside of the US, and a particular relationship they want to have with the US government, which is deliberately and overtly anti-green capitalism, and quite dramatically so, and yet at the same time have these resources that are integrated into the system there. I do wonder what the options are for, well, first of all, how you think that might start to play out over the next few years. That there's this, what seems to be a moment of tension, at least for those countries now in the hands of the right, where governments are in the hands of the right, and also what we might do to learn the lessons of the relative failure of governments that are left to not be able to win the election again, to convince people that they were doing the right thing. Chile in particular seems to be an outstanding example here. What lessons might we learn? How might we do better next time round?
So there's a supreme irony in a lot of countries right now that are governed by the right, which is unfortunately many countries, both global south and global north, that have either major mineral sectors or have the ambition of being a major mining producer, in which they are ostensibly kind of encouraging investment in the very minerals that are necessary for the energy transition, among other end uses, but primarily the energy transition, really. But maybe on a rhetorical but also policy level, they are aligned against the green fraction of capital that we were discussing earlier. This is probably, this irony is at kind of the highest pitch perhaps within the United States, which is of course governed by Trump and by right-wing coalition, and Trump is very in favor and has said explicitly, I want to do minerals dominance, he calls it, in executive actions. I want to dominate these new critical mineral sectors, and the ones that he's talking about, from lithium to rare earths, when you look at their demand streams, where these minerals actually go to, what industries they serve, he might like to talk about AI and drones or military tech or data centers, but in reality, it's wind turbines and electric vehicle batteries that compose kind of the largest portion of demand for these minerals. So ironically, he's boosting the kind of upstream part of the sectors that downstream he is destroying or attempting to destroy at least the political support for. That won't work out very well, I will say. From just a perspective, I'm taking off my eco-socialist hat and kind of putting on my just analyst of capitalism hat. And I do not think that it's possible to incentivize the growth of sectors while destroying the demand for them. And so there are a lot of contradictions in his industrial policy, if we want to call it writ large. And then those contradictions reverberate elsewhere with the kind of states that he's trying to turn into client states of the US, and these transactional deals, and trying to get their access to their minerals as well, or their oil, or whatever it is. But there's no overarching developmental strategy nor kind of stable underpinnings for ongoing international coordination and collaboration, because on the one hand, he's threatening the country. On the other hand, he's offering it something or trying to cajole it into something. And I don't think that will create a stable set of alliances for these new mineral partnerships that Trump is unrolling. But I think they do show how durable what I call the critical minerals consensus is. That consensus is not attached to any particular end use or developmental goal or vision of the energy transition. It's increasingly just about the geopolitical leverage that inheres in choke points of resource extraction. And we're seeing that right now. We're recording during this catastrophic war in Iran, and I know this will be released a bit later, but we're seeing in real time, constantly, week after week, how important these choke points are and how much governments and geopolitics are kind of reverberating around them. Maybe just to say one, I think, important lesson for the left in all of this, before maybe moving on to the final part of your question. There are a number of contradictions and risks and really just negative aspects of what we might call state capitalism in the U.S. right now. The way in which the U.S. government is directly intervening in critical minerals and energy and in tech and in all of these ways. On the other hand, on the left, we, I think, have been talking for a while now, since the Green New Deal, if not much before it, about public ownership, about state involvement and public sector involvement in the economy. And by the state, we don't just mean like technocratic agencies or the military or security arms of the state. That's how the right wing uses the state. We mean a commons. We mean a public sector. We mean shared ownership. We mean forms of investment that are inclusive and create jobs and dignity and, community welfare and whatever it is. But I do think the Overton window has shifted and has moved. And now that right-wing, fossil fascists are kind of taking ownership positions in shareholder-owned firms, like, who's to say that the left can't do public ownership? I mean, it's just totally on the table, regardless of the ideological stripe of a given political movement. And that I think, whether it doesn't mechanically benefit us, but we should make it benefit us when we should talk about that quite frontally and lay out our own political program of public ownership and state involvement in the economy. On the front of the global south and these extractive frontiers and how to govern them, it is so challenging. And I really want to make this clear because I think that it's wrong to think it's just bad policies or like this or that government made a mistake. I mean, we can always get to that level of kind of the day-to-day of politics and see where governments could have made a different decision. But I think the problem is more structural than that. And so the solutions need to be more structural than that. I'll just tick them off really briefly. This is the way that I think about these dilemmas of extractivism in the global south. There are developmental dilemmas. It is hard to take raw materials and turn that into economic development or social or human development for a variety of reasons that we've kind of already gone over, perhaps. There are geopolitical dilemmas. It is very hard at this moment as a global south government to know which great power to align with or how to play the game in this increasingly kind of in this world that's increasingly made up of economic and geopolitical blocks. And you know, if you get investment from China, are you relinquishing investment from the West or vice versa? How do you stay strategically autonomous in this moment? That's really challenging. There are distributive battles. So in every extractive economy, regardless of what specific phase of capitalism we're in, there's a central question of who benefits from that resource extraction. Where do the rents and revenues and royalties go? Do they help the local community, the national majority? Do they enrich a corrupt few? And so this is a central aspect, whether it's a petro state or a mining state. That's a constant dilemma. And then the last, but maybe most important to our conversation, is the socio-ecological dilemma. It is just the case that these sectors concentrate social and ecological harms in ways that are unparalleled in other sectors. And global south governments, even with good, ambitious developmentalist policies, face communities that are increasingly intolerant of these concentrated harms. And so we need to think about developmentalism paired with ecology and care and think more broadly about industrial policy, which is, I think, exactly what some of the most innovative global south left political programs are doing. But developmentalism and resource nationalism will not address that ecological and social conflict that happens at the front lines of extraction.
Something you've talked about just now, it's something that's critical to the book, is the concept of the frontiers in capitalism, which is sort of sitting here listening to you and thinking about it, having read the book, is the distance between what we might have been having as a conversation when I first really started getting politically active, and now it's painfully like 20 years ago, when the rhetoric and to a large extent actually the reality was globalization has triumphed everywhere. This is now a single world that is united around a free market. This is the only way we have of running capitalism. I mean, that's never entirely true, but this is like neoliberalism triumphant. The market will deliver. Tony Blair telling us that you can't argue against globalization, you may as well argue against autumn coming, or whatever his expression was in 2005. At the peak of this, China joining the World Trade Organization, Hart and Negri's Empire, which came out, as we discussed, in 2000, right at the sort of start of this really triumphal moment for globalization, which argued that, you know, there was kind of one system that was pretty smooth space everywhere called empire. And this really affected how activists thought about the world because they're responding to circumstances. The change that we now have to suddenly it's a world of frontiers and choke points, and where control of frontiers and choke points is critical not only for capital but also for governments. And the notion of sovereignty coming back in, a key theme in this After Order series, as something governments now have in relation to those frontiers and to those choke points. We're seeing, as you mentioned, a graphic demonstration of that in the Straits of Hormuz in terms of what Iran has been doing and how that impacts the entire world economy. It's a version of sovereignty you can see enacted there. So it's almost that shortages and difficulties create the space where versions of sovereignty can work, and potentially democratic versions of sovereignty can work.
Resource frontiers never fit the narrative of hypermobile capitalism. And I think at that very moment, and it's interesting to kind of do a retrospective, 25 years later, 26 years later, on the moment of kind of, okay, we're finally at the end of history. Capitalism spans the earth. It's a flat earth. It's a grid that can be seamlessly interconnected. And when you have place-based assets, literal geological deposits, that formed under millions of years, under, not by any kind of human intent, those place-based assets cannot be picked up and move. And some of that very fact informs the basic structure of extractive economies, which have enormous sunk costs, where companies lay down physical investments to both get the stuff out of the ground, and then the logistics. It's kind of interesting. Logistics is what makes a smooth capitalism, but also involves a lot of place-based assets of ports and straits and shipping routes and all of that. And so what we're seeing now was sort of true all along. It just wasn't as geopolitically salient, perhaps, in kind of the heyday of neoliberal globalization. But we should note that 2000, the year that book was published that you just mentioned, was also the beginning of a major commodity boom. In fact, a rather unprecedented commodity supercycle that lasted almost a decade and a half, during which there was major demand for raw materials coming from China's industrialization and urbanization processes, as well as other emerging markets at the same time. How was that demand filled? By huge mines and oil rigs and soya plantations being opened up across the global south. So at the very moment that supposedly capitalism is its most seamless, it's actually reverberating and redounding to the most physical assets that then, yes, become choke points. Those choke points can be leveraged towards different political ends, and I'll just name two. One is the local community. They can actually leverage the fact that spatially they exist at a choke point of global capitalism, the most upstream part. If that oil or mineral does not come out of the ground, then the rest of the supply chain is not going to function. Labor unions as well, labor strikes can be quite powerful, as we know from the history of mining militancy. So that's one way to leverage those choke points. Another, perhaps less kind of copacetic with a left perspective, is the geopolitical leverage of those assets, right? And so we see now from China's blocking of its rare earth exports to what's happening with Iran leveraging the Strait of Hormuz, and we can think of all sorts of other examples with the Houthis, the Red Sea, etc. We see that geopolitical adversaries can take hold of the choke points that are in or around their jurisdictions and leverage them either in relatively bloodless geoeconomic conflict, or in quite bloody geopolitical hard conflict. And that reality is super apparent. But then the question is, what does the left do about that? And I think that there are a number of things. I won't be comprehensive, but I'll just name two. We need to think about what it would look like, taking into account North and South inequality, not kind of obviating that, but what would it look like to have collaboration and cooperation around the world's resources in ways that are more beneficial to the locally affected communities and landscapes, but also kind of carve out some type of pathway towards shared green development globally. And that is a tricky question, because countries are on such unequal footing with these resources and with the impacts of their extraction. But we need to start laying out programs, both maybe starting with South-South coordination, where countries are more similar in their economic interests, but also what would a kind of global governance of these resource commons look like? Even if that feels far afield, our enemies are thinking of a quite different regime of governing these sectors, and we need to have our own counterpoint.
Well, that's the final question I wanted to put to you, which is, well, what does the alternative to all this look like? What would a socially and environmentally just alternative to the world you described start to look like?
The standard way to think about a better outcome for extractive sectors is to think about local forms of governance. By that, I mean in the host countries or the host communities. Okay, we need better laws, we need better regulations, better contract models, community benefits agreements, real consultation and consent of indigenous communities, rights of nature, protection of human rights so that when people protest, they're not killed. I'm in favor of all those things, including state ownership, public ownership, interesting ownership models that could pertain in the sites of extraction. But I also view that as an insufficient way to think about the transformation that's needed. We need to address the climate crisis rapidly, and we need to do so without either kind of triggering more geopolitical conflict or triggering much more extractivism. And so I see that's the kind of one way to think about the trilemma. And a way to do all of that can't actually start from the frontiers of extraction. We need to start from the kind of motor of accumulation and consumption that drives that extraction in the first place. Places are not born to be mining frontiers. They become mining frontiers because capitalism needs certain raw materials, and some configuration of politics and economics set certain places up to be the frontiers of that extraction. In order to change that fact, we need to think about how we consume and how we produce globally, but also, as I said, in the kind of dense centers of consumption and production. And that means thinking about ways to reduce resource use while meeting our climate and equity and also kind of geopolitical goals. We want a more peaceful political situation. We want more equitable access to clean tech and green tech, and we want to do all of that while rapidly drawing down emissions. It turns out, and I was dismissive of a win-win-win approach earlier, but there is a little bit of a win-win here, because the same approaches that would create more public asset to clean technologies, which I think everyone deserves, mobility, energy, clean and green constructed housing, whatever it is, create more access for those, reduce geopolitical tensions by kind of lowering the stakes of these resources and their kind of leverage and choke point role in the economy, and get to our climate goals faster. And in order to do that, according to every climate model, we do need to change how we consume and produce. We need to get out of our cars and into the tube or into buses. We need to get out of single family suburban homes and into kind of dense green social housing, right? So we need to do all these things that we know about politically on the left. The thing is that achieving that would also reduce the resource intensity of the energy transition. The more that we can consume collectively and equitably, the less our resource footprint for the energy transition. And I don't just say that as like a point of like political vision or rabble rousing, though I think, you can run a campaign that way, and we should, but it's empirically true. All of the models, including ones that I participated in creating, show that the most resource intensive way to kind of confront the climate crisis is to do nothing about the mode of consumption and production. It's to leave it as privatized, as unequal. And the most resource, kind of the least resource intensive way to address the energy transition would actually be to create shared consumption and to kind of share the ecology and resources that underpin all of human consumption and production. And that's the route that we need to be going for. And for me, on a political front, I don't mind if politicians talk about reducing resource intensity or reducing mining or even about justice for extractive frontiers and resource frontiers. I would like that, but maybe in every political venue that doesn't make sense. But you can fight for social housing. You can fight for mass transit. You can fight for energy for all and more efficient energy systems. And it turns out that in the process of getting those things, wherever they're achieved, you reduce the resource intensity of the energy transition, and you also reach our climate goals more quickly.
Thea Riofrancos, thank you very much for joining us on After Order.
Thank you so much for having me.